Well, hello, and welcome to my cellar again. I've got a number of interesting things to talk about tonight, and I'm saving all the best for last. The alignment thing and the boule thing. So you can come back later if that's what you came for. In the meantime, we'll get on with the rest. Okay, first comment. Repurposing magic / stuff weirdly. Back in the day, I didn't DM much. My friend DM'd us at school lunchtimes. His elder brother DM'd us on weekends. One of the times I did DM, school lunch DM wanted a wizard to cut off his PC's hands, put large lace cuffs on the stumps, and then glue his hands back on again so the PC always had frilly cuffs. It was such a weird request, it put me off my stroke, as it were. Well, I can see where it might. However, it is D&D. And as the DM, if you can lead him to somebody that can do that and charge him all the money in the world, let him do it if he thinks frilly cuffs are that cool. Hindsight, us kids were not mature enough to deal with change at all gracefully. Yeah, well, it is hard to do, isn't it? Being able to deal with change is something that comes with either age or experience or both. I cannot for the life of me think why anybody would want their hands cut off and then you could have put the lace cuffs on without cutting off the hands if you're going to go to a wizard. Anyway, logic and fantasy, okay, poles apart. How far apart these poles are is up to the players, but the central tension in fantasy RPGs is verisimilitude versus magic. I agree. That's a very good point. The question is, how do orcs, spells, spaceships, laser pistols, etc. affect the reality of the world you play in? Well, the reality of the world you play in is something that is begun by the DM, but is filled out and populated and fleshed out, if you will, by the players as the game goes on. Anyway, we'll keep going. To illustrate, an orc versus a sword. One is a real world, but both are in the imaginary RPG world. How do they intersect requires a certain logic. That is, our game states, for example, our game states that any sword that hits an orc turns into a harmless bunch of flowers. It's not realistic, but it is the logic of the game. And it sounds like fun. Well, you're right. The logic of the game, the verisimilitude of the game, is begun by the DM. The more verisimilitude he applies, the more his players will do also. At least that's been my experience and my observation all over all these many, many years. Logic is important to satisfy our expectations. Again, you're right. The logic of your world has to be consistent so that things work consistently and that there is a certain level of correct expectation before something is done. Let's see, what else is going to say? By defining the mechanics of the game, we can take the real-world sword concept into the imaginary and use it on magical creatures in a way that invests us in the consequences of gameplay as a form of entertainment, I think. Yeah, I think you bring up some very good points there. It's important that your world has some sort of skeletal framework to hang everything else on. Now, a little later, I'm going to talk about backstories in worlds, and that's how that can change. But even with a backstory, it still provides a framework for the players to be able to rely on. Next, let's see. Okay, here we go. History. Tim, in terms of world building, what are the most important effects and benefits of establishing a history? Further, what did being a history teacher teach you that be useful for RPG history, inventing and presenting one's history to best effect. All right, I'm going to stop there. What's the most important effects? It establishes how your world works, both ethically, socially, magically. Um, when I sat down several years ago, when I was part of Eldridge Enterprises, we were looking at the possibility of printing some campaigns of ours, and I sat down and started writing a backstory. In fact, the backstory of my world goes back about 4,000 years. I aped Tolkien in that I had ages, or eras, if you will, eras, if you will. But in doing that, for instance, there was a magical experiment that went horribly, hideously wrong. Some unnamed delver in the black arts unleashed something he shouldn't, caused a physical cataclysm, rendered a huge continent into pieces, unleashed all sorts of holy hell, wiped out a good portion of the humans, led to a period where the dark races ruled the world and humans were hunted. I wrote all this stuff down. I've got it somewhere in my computer or whatever. But in so doing, I set up the social, they don't like them because of, they do like them because of. I established why magic varies on my world. Normal most of the places, weak some places, very strong fewer places. But by doing that, I'm able to establish how things work, why they work, why a given race might have a certain quirk or peculiarity, or a given people might have a certain quirk or peculiarity. Because we're formed by our history, and that's one thing I know as a history teacher. We are formed by our history. When we ignore our history, we have to get beat over the head a couple of times, and then hopefully we learn the lesson. That's why I think backstories on your world are important. I think if you're going to start a new campaign, it's worth writing all that out. I think if you're in an established campaign and you want to start establishing the backstory, let them find stuff that you've written, in the course of the game, the tattered portion of a history, all that's left, and then, and you can feed them bits and pieces until they piece it together themselves. They can simply be ignorant of what led to the chaotic world that they live in now. I'm tainted by the J.R.R. Tolkien brush in that language and differences thereof is a really important factor in a fantasy history for me. It shows a establishment, displacement, dilution of cultures over time. That's fine. If you're into linguistics and you're a linguist, that's great. I'm not. I tend to gloss over that in my worlds, except in the broadest brushstrokes possible. But if that's your bag and you're into language, that's swell. Mine, I don't get into the evolution or de-evolution of language as a result of the cataclysm. Different strokes for different folks. What do I think about the language angle? Well, if that's what you're into, that's fine. I'm not. Simply because it just doesn't float my boat. Doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it. And it can be a big part of an ongoing campaign, learning the different languages, finding scrolls that translate, finding a magic item that translates for you. That could be incredibly valuable in a world that has 10 or 12 or 14 active languages. And, God knows how many dead ones. Excuse me. All right. Breaking magic items. Can one break a wand of magic missiles and have all the magic missiles activate at once at the usual damage level? P.S. I saw the move in a Founders and Legends game at the last GaryCon. The DM, Mike Merles, allowed it with rolls and an enchanted shield. Well, Nowadays, you got to define what edition are you playing. Founders and Legends could have been any edition, could have been 5, could have been 1. I don't know. In my world, if you were somehow able to break a wand, and I've talked about enchanted items just a week or two ago, about how the magic is instilled into them and it permeates them and binds them and whatever. If somebody did that at Magic Missiles, broke it like that, it would be a whole lot more than just the sum of the magic missiles, because then there would be the inherent energy stored in the wand itself, and I'd make it go off like I would make it. I'm not saying Merle's was wrong. Okay, I'm not saying Mike was wrong. I would have had it go off like a fireball in a contained room because of the sudden unleashing of the magic that bound the wand together. That's what I would do. And it probably wouldn't be survivable. I can't say that as a blanket ruling, but I'm saying there's a good possibility it would not be survivable. And there was a follow-up on that. Destroying a magic item might also release a curse. That's a great thing to do. If somehow or other you inadvertently destroy something, or on purpose probably they should get it more. But yeah, I can see that there's a curse, and then that has to be lifted, and maybe the only way it can be lifted is on a quest. You got to go find something or other, and that makes a whole new side adventure off the campaign. Great idea. Speaking of recordings, are there any recordings of sessions run by Gary? I've scoured the internet from YouTube to Reddit and can't find anything. I know it was a very different time back then and cameras weren't as accessible as they are in 2020, but I'd really like to listen to a full session Gary was DMing just to hear his style. No, I'm absolutely convinced there aren't any out there. The only way there would have been for someone to set up a video camera off to the side, and knowing Gary as I did, I doubt he would have permitted that. For a number of different reasons. One of them being a little self-conscious, being spied on it the whole time. It's not the same as giving a talk in front of 300 people. Giving a talk in 300 people is a lot easier. That you're right, there was no technology for that. I would be astonished if one turned up. And again, I don't think Gary would have allowed it. I don't think he'd have been comfortable doing it. I know I was terribly uncomfortable the first couple times I did it, and it was some years after that. So anyway, no, I'm pretty sure there's nothing out there like that. What are my thoughts on character sheets? I personally favor index cards. On one side, you get your stats, and the other side, you get your stuff. Simple and easy. Paper clips are great for adding cards if the character lives past the first few levels. All right. Now, I don't want to diss anybody that makes a character sheet, and God knows there's enough of them out there. And if that's your bag, or if that's what your DM wants you to do, is to keep sheets so that you're consistent, okay. You're right. Index cards were just as good. That's what we used to use before there were character sheets. We would have our stats on one side and our stuff on the other. I don't see a problem with that. It's certainly less expensive, certainly cheaper to replace. If you want to go, and the point about if they live that long is a good one. Before you go spend money on a pretty sheet or your ink and your paper, if you're downloading a downloadable one, think about, whether or not you're going to survive. It's a lot harder to tear up a pretty sheet than it is to throw away an index card. But hey, I got nothing against them. I've seen a few that I thought were pretty damn expensive for what they were, But hey, TSR sold them too. We sold the first, well, at least one of their very first character sheets. Judges Guild might have had something that predated us. I'm not sure. But and yeah, I don't think there was anything else that predated us that was commercial. Now, there's a game I'm blanking on right now. We Warriors. We Warriors put out character sheets before we did, and they're part of the reason we decided to do it ourselves. Not necessarily for the money. It's just that the We Warriors art wasn't where we wanted to see fantasy art go. And so that was part of the reason. But they were licensed. We Warriors is one of the first companies that was licensed to do that kind of stuff. Let's see, next page. Okay, a recent episode concerning cursed items reminded me of an article from Dragon Magazine, issue 215, putting evil items to good use. 215, that's about, well, that was well into they were a house organ, wasn't it? Which includes such ideas as using a cursed ring to cancel the effects of another cursed ring, using bags of devouring as an assassination tool, refilling daggers of venom with holy water for affecting Hey, if you're as the DM, if you want your players to be able to do this, do it. Do it. In my campaign, there was this 12th or 14th level wizard dude, that my players occasionally went to when they needed something heavy duty. He was an NPC, and they were all first, second, third level players. So 12th, 14th level was like a demigod, especially in OE. Um, fine. We used to allow spell research. I've said before, there was a guy that had about 8 variations on a fireball, from little bitty ones that don't lit the campfire to, varying in between and special effects and whatever. And yeah, okay, cost him a whole lot of money. And I don't know that a couple of them he ever got to use, at least while I was there. But they were kind of like special effect fireballs. Okay, fine. There's another question here later on that'll deal with this sort of again. Here's one. Somebody's trying to get my ass in trouble. Should female fighters be restricted to maximum 16 strength? If you're playing pure fantasy, no. That was the first answer. The second answer, I say no, but if you want to play something closer to real world, go for it. Let me tell you about that. We had a lot of debate around the office about putting what we were doing. We weren't gatekeeping or any of that shit. We were trying to give real life parameters for females that that wanted to play, or guys that wanted to play a female character. There was a lot of that in the early days. It didn't mean anything. They were just experimenting with role playing. We felt that realistically, it's just about the same time that we printed the article about, it was essentially stat yourself. How many pounds can you bench press? Divide that by 10. Okay. How we had all kinds of real life equivalencies to stat yourself, and most people realize they didn't come out all that great, especially gamers, because gamers were not known for being physically fit back then. So it was probably around the same time, and we were still trying to see if we couldn't apply a baking form, if you will, because the game was still being baked, and we were trying to guide it. And now today, I'm not going to say yes because I would be pilloried by all the woke social justice warriors and the feminists for saying that. And they'd be right because it's fantasy. You make the world, you make the rules that govern your world, and it's fantasy. So, no, I mean, again, we talked earlier in this episode about verisimilitude. 18 double aught is Lou Ferrigno, Arnold Schwarzenegger plus because of what an 18 double aught's allowed to do. I'm pretty sure Arnold can't batter down uh, wooden doors that are banded in iron, but we allow that in the game. The musculature necessary to be incredibly strong invariably distorts the body. Look at any female weightlifter. Now, some female weightlifters could certainly be an 18. But also look at male or female weightlifters that can be that strong. They're not very agile, more often than not, because they become muscle bound. You can't find armor that fits somebody that's all roided up. Never find a suit of armor that'll fit you. At least that's the way it would be in my world. Anyway, I'm not gonna be a sexist and say no. It's fantasy. Do what you will. Okay, here's follow up from the earlier. What was the most imaginating repurposing of a cursed item you have seen, either your own party or by yourself? Well, taking a mimic that was immobilized in the form of a large chest and putting it in a bag of holding and allowing it to be found by the person you wanted to be allowed. So everything you threw in got eaten. And then when you reached in to find out why, the mimic got you. I thought it was a pretty good idea. I don't know how well it would stand up to the ridiculous scrutiny that we give stuff in fantasy. To me, it sounded like a great idea. Yeah, go for it, and it worked. Okay, here's one. Why are familiars always portrayed as small or tiny in size comparison to the characters or NPCs? Well, let's think about that. What in mythology and folklore? What are familiars? They're small animals, not real intelligent. Obviously, they're animals. Um, they're dependent upon you for a good deal of their upkeep. Consider feeding a raven as opposed to feeding a 200-pound cage fighter. Consider the attention that 200-pound cage fighter would attract as opposed to someone who happens to have a pet raven or a pet mole or whatever. Familiars were supposed to be funnels or foci of power, and the mythology of familiars varies. I think the one we're most familiar with is witches and their cats. In some, the cats are like a battery of juice walking alongside, and the witch has access to the juice in the battery. Others are foci of power being granted by from another plane or another thing. Small doesn't attract attention. Big does. I mean, hey, it'd be great to have an elephant for a familiar, But you got to feed that thing. You got to clean up all that elephant poop afterwards. And you got to wonder just how many people are going to stare at you walking into the village with an elephant. Um, it all depends on how you view familiars and what their purpose is in aiding or assisting the person whose familiar they are. You got to feed them. You got to maintain them, or else you got to let them feed. If you got a Nubian lion for a familiar, people are going to start complaining when their sheep and goats start turning up missing. And you got to feed them. I don't know. Maybe because little things are seemingly more sinister. I don't know. A dragonette makes a much better familiar than a dragon. Well, even if you could tame a dragon, you're not Daenerys Targaryen. You ride, fly, walk into town with a dragon, you're going to be perceived a whole lot differently than if you walk in with a little dragonette on your shoulder or on your wrist or whatever. I guess. I don't know. I didn't write all those ancient stories. But that sounds like a good idea to me. But hey, what do I know? All right, here we go. All right, now keep in mind that I don't bash. Well, there is one version that I do bash for being stupid, but for the most part, I don't bash the editions. I don't care what edition you play. It's obvious that I'm a first edition, old guy, old school guy, old too, yeah. But I'm getting comments that, okay, 5e is becoming crybaby D&D. Ooh, if 5e is the reason that they're coming out with all this sanitization of the races and their behavior patterns and all that, then I agree with that statement. 5e is fantasy. Logic doesn't apply. Okay, there's that too. And if people playing 5e have their version of fantasy, that's fine. We all have a different version of fantasy. Every one of us are playing somebody else's campaign because nobody's campaigns are cookie cutters. We can cookie cut when we go, do adventures and stuff. But as you well know, if you've played any at all, you can have 8 groups run through a given adventure module, and you'll get 8 different stories out of it. You can run your own group through a couple of times, and the second or third time will be different than the first. Even if you move stuff around, it'll still be different. Next comment: if you don't like what 5e offers, then play something else. It's that simple. Exactly. Don't waste your time whining about what 5e is or isn't. Ignore it. It's not hurting any of us. The people that want more than what that offers, they'll find us. And if they never come looking for us, that's fine too. They're having fun. And that's all the game industry was ever about. Facilitating people's fun. Okay. And then see, I don't give Hasbro any of my money. Well, that's certainly your choice, and I don't either. But then again. All right. Now, I got 3 things left. And the first is the story of alignment. I have here the standard 9. Oh, it's glaring real badly. There we go. The standard 9 points of alignment. Now, the first thing you have to keep in mind is that as we were envisioning alignment, and as Gary was envisioning the concept of alignment in the original D&D, We weren't talking about entire nations, governments, or races. We were looking at alignment as it pertained to individual adventurers. We weren't describing a fascist state. The what will good, evil, and neutral we'll get to in a minute. Lawful and chaotic meant that a race that we, or a people, or whatever that we deemed as lawful, meant that they would usually respond in the same way given the same circumstances. Okay, they followed a core belief, a belief system, a belief pattern, and given a given circumstance, you could count on them to follow their ethic, their ethos. A chaotic person. We originally had elves as chaotic because chaotic meant capricious, changeable, unreliable, if you will. That's what chaotic meant. Not likely to be predicted for their reaction, or not always predictable for their reaction, not always predictable in their behavior. Neutral was clearly down the middle of the road, looking out for self. A neutral character, a neutral monster, or whatever, would more often than not choose self-interest. Now, these three things were also for the DM. How do you use these three definitions or delineations as a DM? All right. The chaotic ones shouldn't always react the same, given different circumstances or whatever. They should react differently. Neutral, we're going to do what was good for them. Not necessarily evil, not necessarily good, neutral. Okay? I'm not getting into religious comparisons because I'll bound to offend somebody. But these were applied to single adventurers or single monsters or for the purpose of encounters. But first and foremost, it was the player characters. And so if you were going to be lawful, you had to be lawful all the time and you had to act consistently. And you probably did. If you were playing, especially if you were playing a human. Thieves gave us a great deal of trouble because people wanted to see thieves as evil. Thieves are neutral in that regard. They're going to look out for themselves. Now, when you get to the the good, the neutral again, and the evil, those are somewhat self-explanatory. Those are indicators of the philosophy that PC or NPC operates under, not predictors of their behavior. Now, I read this that somebody was kind enough to send me, and I don't know who's responsible for it. Lawful good, enforce the rules in order to follow your moral code. Well, yes and no, but lawful good has to be tempered with moderation, or they become lawful evil. Can't go around beating people on the back of the head with the flat of your sword because they don't adhere to because now you're no longer good. Lawful evil, this definition I find horrifying. Oppress others with establishments because order is above morality is necessary for your continued dominance. Well, that sounds like you're defining a fascist state. Now, if you want to define a evil wizard, okay, that probably works. True neutral, self-serve, usually with apathy and obedience. Well, I don't know about obedience, but indifference might work there. You don't get too excited about anything. You tolerate a lot. Um, if you are heavily into the religious pantheon aspect of your campaign, then if you got a neutral god that's pretty much a go with the flow kind of guy, I guess that's who you'd align yourself with. Chaotic neutral, act for yourself without regard for laws or morals, but don't go out of your way to hurt others. Yeah, that's not bad. But again, some of this is taken to, and I've seen other discussions of this where they've taken it almost to a socialist or a nationalist or a fascist extreme. It was originally intended to help DMs see whether how their players were playing. Were they following their own espoused beliefs? And if they weren't, consequences. I may have talked about this a while ago, several years ago. I DM'd a game by request, and all these guys had learned to play in prison, and they didn't pay much. The prison sense of alignment is considerably different because I had to remind the guy that I'd given the paladin character to play that no, he couldn't poke the other guy's eyes out to get information because that was not what good paladins did. And it got tense a couple of times when I absolutely forbade him to do something because paladins didn't do that. Just a little anecdote. Okay. Yesterday, Thursday, big to do on Facebook. I don't know what other social media because I don't go there. About, oh boy, somebody had found that they could buy a bunch of old TSR logos. And they were, hey, anybody that's a designer in the yada yada da da da, come on. Well, number one, it's a bunch of old logos from the 70s and 80s. And yeah, they're pretty. Um, it's unclear yet whether or not they have the right to use them anywhere outside of the state of Wisconsin, because I guess the D&D Museum is involved with this, and I support the D&D Museum wholeheartedly. In fact, I've made three what I consider to be significant donations to the museum. Just because you put the Lizard Man on your next project doesn't make you TSR. Those of us who were or are TSR, we know the difference. You could you can make a new car and call it a Buick, but it's not a Buick. I don't know why everybody's so excited. Oh boy, we can get these and license them. Why? To be fair, outside of the old school Facebook pages and organizations like that, most people have no idea what significance any of those things have to begin with. Now, I thought the Lizard Man logo was the coolest one we had, but beyond that, so, just because you stamp an old logo on the front of your box, don't try and convince people that you're TSR. Okay, what much of you have been waiting for. And this is the last time I'm going there. The pedantic crap that has been engendered by this topic just astonishes me. How so many people can get so wound up. Of course, I'm speaking of the Boule. The Boule was in the First Dragon. The First Dragon was published during a period of time in our history when we in the United States did not think very much of France. That I don't even know how to do that, Franco revulsion, whatever, culminated in a website, one of the early websites that was, pardon my language, fuckfrance.com. De Gaulle was a pain in the ass. Never wanted to play ball with NATO during the height of the Cold War. And so we really didn't like France. And as English language speakers, or American language speakers, if you prefer, we thought one of the height of what was wrong with France is when they decided they would have an official language committee, and you couldn't use words in French advertising like hamburger or hot dog or something that wasn't French. So we didn't like the French very much. So we made fun of the French. Now I came to make my monster. Alone in the back bedroom, replay of Saturday night, a rerun of Saturday Night Live on. I'm pretty sure I probably had a buzz going because I was writing. And one thing led to another. First off, the original plastic monster. Oh, I thought I had one here on the desk. I must have moved it. The original plastic monster, the one or two times it appeared in the Greyhawk campaign, was simply called the Bullet. Bullet. Because it ran down the hall, knocked a bunch of people off their feet, and ran away before they could do anything to it. So, okay, it has a name, Bullet. Well, let's Frenchify it a little bit. Bulet. Now, I'm getting sick to death. What language is that? That's not the way French is pronounced. It's Mandarin, you pedantic twits. My language from my world. Therefore, what I gave you in the very first introduction was the correct pronunciation as rendered in Mandarin. Now argue that. My world, my language, my spelling, my pronunciation. Get over it. It seems that some of you people have this inflated sense of self-righteousness. You're going to produce it. Oh, I produced a bullet in my campaign. I don't give a damn. If you choose to be willfully ignorant, knock yourself out. The day I published it, I gave you the pronunciation. If that just breaks you up so badly, snowflakes, don't use them or call it whatever the hell you want. I really don't care. Now, I told you last week I got some games coming up. I forgot to mention that you will need video. If you sign up in this game, you will need video. Now, let's see what else. I think that takes care of everything on my list. I believe I've talked about all the things I promised I would talk about. I'm done, call the belay whatever the hell you want. Call it a ball snuffler. I don't care. If your sense of self-righteous indignation insists it's not French, get over it. It's a made-up language and a made-up game in fantasy. Get over it. I told you how I pronounced the word. I created the monster. If you don't like the way I pronounce the word, tough shit. And on that note, I'll bid you all Dodata Govi. I'm still figuring out when this thing starts. Welcome to my cellar.
He's the curmudgeon who wrote about the dungeons. Now he's the feller, live from the cellar. Talks about D&D and old school RPGs. Still quite a feller, the curmudgeon in the cellar.
Last man around when the rates went down. Called in Gary in that Lake Geneva town. Hey Gary, it's an awful mess. Let me edit, we'll have success. D&D and Dragon Magazine.
He's the curmudgeon who wrote about the dungeons. Now he's the feller, live from the cellar. Talks about D&D and old school RPGs, but he's still quite the feller, the curmudgeon in the cellar.
Magic missile, it's a mortar shell. Make it hit in the first level spell. Brought psionics to the game to attack that wizard brain. ESR and fantasy, collection of micro armory. Tight with tramp under a tree, high as could be.
He's the curmudgeon who wrote about the dungeons. Now he's the feller, live from the cellar. Talks about D&D and old school RPGs, but he's still quite the feller, the curmudgeon in the cellar.
Still quite the feller, the curmudgeon in the cellar.
Curmudgeon.